So we talked a lot about how to formulate your research question. Now let's talk about how to design your research. And you probably remember that there are 4 aspects of a compelling answer to a research question, which are that there are no alternative explanations, accurate measurements, external validity, and reliability. And in this section, we're going to focus primarily on ruling out alternative explanations. We want to make sure that there's only one possible way to interpret our findings. Okay, in the last section, we formulated a research question which is basically about an independent variable influencing a dependent variable. And in this section, we're going to ask ourselves primarily, how can we figure out whether causal effects are going from the first variable to the second variable? For example, how can we figure out whether the number of friends influences depression? So let's have a look at a little example. Let's say we're interested in the number of friends and depression. And so therefore we conduct a little study and we just ask people, how many friends do you have and how depressed do you feel at this moment on a scale from 1 to 10? You may notice that if we ask these questions, then our 2 variables are numerical. It's about the number of friends and depression on a scale from 1 to 10. And what we want to see in our study is a statistical relationship between these 2 variables. So for example, we may want to see that as the number of friends goes up, depression goes down, or vice versa. As the number of friends goes down, depression goes up. So what could that look like in our study? Well, let's say, for example, that our first participant told us that he has 0 friends and he feels very, very depressed, 9 out of 10. And the second participant tells us that she has many friends and she doesn't feel very depressed, 1 out of 10. Then the next participant tells us that she has 4 friends and her depression level is 3. So what we can see here already is that the people who have low scores on friends have a high score on being depressed, whereas the people who have high scores on friends have low scores on being depressed. And people who fall in the middle in terms of the number of friends also fall roughly into the middle in terms of depression. And that is an example of a statistical relationship. Okay, so let's say that we found such a statistical relationship in our study. We found that as the number of friends goes up, depression goes down, or vice versa. As the number of friends goes down, depression goes up. Now, what does that mean? Can we just conclude that the number of friends influences depression? And unfortunately, the answer is no. Because whenever we find a statistical relationship between 2 variables, there are always 3 possible explanations for this relationship. So one possible explanation could indeed be that the number of friends influences depression. Specifically, the more friends you have, the less depressed you feel, or the fewer friends you have, the more depressed you feel. However, an alternative explanation is that depression influences the number of friends, because after all, depressive people are not exactly fun to be with. So it could just be that once people become depressed, they just have trouble finding friends. And then, as a result, we find that people who are depressed don't have many friends. So it may not be a lack of friends causing depression, but depression causing a lack of friends. And based on the results we just described, we have no clue which of these explanations is the truth. And in fact, there's one more explanation, also called the third variable explanation. And in this explanation, you assume that there's some third variable, which is influencing both my independent variable and my dependent variable. So an example here could be job pressure. It could be that if people experience very high job pressure, then that reduces the number of friends because they just don't have time for friends anymore. And it also makes them depressed because having a lot of job pressure is very stressful. And it can make you depressed. And it may be that there's absolutely no causal relationship between the number of friends and feeling depressed. They may be quite independent of each other. But just because of that third variable influencing them both, we see that people who don't have a lot of friends are very depressed. So why does this matter? And imagine, for example, that you want to give advice based on your research on what to do when a person is depressed. Well, if the correct explanation is that the number of friends influences depression, then you may advise maybe to help a person who is depressed to find more friends. However, if the number of friends does not influence depression, it's only depression that influences the number of friends, then helping a person to find more friends wouldn't help that person to get less depressed. Likewise, if the statistical relationship is caused by job pressure, what we need to change is not the number of friends, but the job pressure. If job pressure is causing people to have a low number of friends and high depression, then reducing that job pressure is the way to go. And so the difference between these explanations matters. And so we need to make sure that we disentangle them in our research. Now the tricky thing is we cannot observe these causal relationships. The only thing we can observe is a statistical relationship between variables, such as, for example, that as the number of friends increases, depression decreases. And we always need to keep in mind that they are these 3 causal mechanisms that could create this statistical relationship. Okay, the key lessons of this video are, there are always 3 main explanations for a statistical relationship. The first is that the independent variable influences the dependent variable. The second explanation is that the dependent variable influences the independent variable. And the third explanation is that a third variable influences both the independent and the dependent variable. And in an ideal research design, only the first explanation is possible. So the only possible explanation is that the independent variable influences the dependent variable. Okay, let's practice this a little bit more in the next video. I'll see you in the next video.